Hey everybody, and welcome back. It's Mr. Arvites with another U.S. history lesson for you. Today we're going to be talking about World War II. We're going to be looking at the Allied offensives in Europe in 1942 and 43, and the Allied strategy in Europe during that same time period. Now, to kind of backtrack on where we are and how we got here, the Allies have, obviously Germany declared war on the United States right after Pearl Harbor. And so 1942, in a lot of ways, is a build-up year for the United States. They're having to ship over large amounts of soldiers. They're having to ship over large amounts of equipment overseas. And so initially the first things we start to do in Germany are going to be bombings and air raids. And ultimately the strategy that the Allies put together is going to be one about air superiority. And so the ultimate strategy that they're going to have are bombers. And that's the same thing in the Pacific. In the Pacific, you look at island hopping campaigns where they're going to bypass certain islands, they're going to bypass highly defended ones and get airfields and bomb further and further to Japan. Well, in the European theater, they're going to be doing the exact same thing. And so when they go to Africa, that's to give them, a bombing in southern Europe. That's to give them their planes bases to land. When they go to Sicily, that's to give them Italy. When they go to Italy, that's to give them southern Germany to bomb. And so that's what all of this is all about. Now, before we talk about the United States, we have to talk about one of our allies, and that's the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviet Union was invaded by Adolf Hitler in 1941, right? So June 1941, July 1941, the Soviet Union is in retreat by July. By August, the armies are in ruins. Hitler's Nazi armies are rampaging across the Soviet Union. And they get all the way to Moscow, all the way to St. Petersburg, where they're going to have very long sieges. And Joseph Stalin, during this time period, during this first 6 months, contemplates killing himself a number of times. And then he takes up the policy of no surrender, no retreat. And so the Soviet Union is going to fight a gigantic war of attrition. And the war in the East, the Soviet war, is the most violent part of the European theater of World War II. Ultimately, the Nazis are going to have to use the most amount of resources there. The Soviets are going to pour thousands of millions of people. When we talk about the Soviet Union losing over 21 million people during the war against the Nazis, and ultimately that becomes a big factor. Now, the Soviet Union by 1942 is still pushed up against a wall. And in 1942, Adolf Hitler is going to turn his eyes toward the oil fields to the south. But instead of going straight to those oil fields and bypassing numerous cities, he's going to go to the city of Stalingrad, right? Present-day Volgograd. Stalingrad held the name of Joseph Stalin. And so for Hitler, this was a political message to do. It also would give them control of the Volga River. The Battle of Stalingrad is one of the single most violent battles in all of human history, with about 1.2 million deaths going along there for the Russians, over 800,000 Germans in the Battle of Stalingrad. It is immensely crowded, compacted city. There are more people fighting in it than actually lived in it prior to the city. They're going to have snipers everywhere. It is an absolute death trap, and the Nazis get caught up in it. And really, Stalin needed to delay, and that's the whole 1942 for Joseph Stalin was delay, because what they're doing off in the Ural Mountains, they're manufacturing and they're building more soldiers. They're training more soldiers. They're building larger army groups. And Stalingrad is going to trap the Germans in there. And they could have gotten out right before winter sets in. But Hitler says, no, keep pushing. As you go to January, as you go to February, where ultimately it collapses, Hitler is ultimately going to have his largest defeat of the war thus far at Stalingrad. And the Germans are going to lose a large amount. We talk about 91,000 German soldiers surrendering when Stalingrad fell, over 800,000 casualties total. The Soviets lose over 1.3 million people in this battle. Now, when the Soviet counterattack featured over 3 million Soviet soldiers, Operation Saturn, right, where they set rings around the Germans, and they began to encircle German lines. And so the Germans began to pull further and further back. Now, so if we really talked about the Eastern Front, and I'm going to give you a brief overview. It's U.S. history, so I don't spend a lot of time on it. In a European history class, world history class, I would. Part of the reason why Hitler's army cannot succeed in Russia is because the main advantages they normally have, which are air cover with the Luftwaffe and then tanks, are going to be offset by two large factors. One is going to be winter, okay? And then the other is going to be fuel shortages. Fuel shortages in winter are going to offset a lot of those advantages. The other big aspect that people don't always kind of think about is for the Luftwaffe, right? They have to have air bases. And when they take over large portions of the Soviet Union, right? We're talking about thousands of square miles. They don't just pacify the whole area. There are large amounts of insurgencies. And so Hermann Göring and the Luftwaffe don't want to keep these airfields too close to the front. And so the German army, for the first time, is going to have to be fighting without pure air cover. And by the time we get to 1943, and then more specifically in 1944, the Russians are going to be outnumbering the Germans in the air. And that's going to be something they have never experienced thus far. So Long story short, Stalin gets a huge win at the Battle of Stalingrad. Hitler is now in retreat going across Eastern Europe starting in 1943. Now, at the same time, the Allies, in the classic sense, Great Britain and the United States, are planning their own invasions, okay? And so what the Allies are doing, first off, they're gonna start planning large-scale bombing of Germany. And the bombing plans were kind of interesting because starting in 1943, Germany is gonna be bombed virtually every day. And the Americans are gonna do it in broad daylight. The British will do it at night because they don't have the numericals that we do. And the story about the airborne soldiers, about these bombers, these bomber raids, are incredibly impressive. You're talking large amounts of casualties, specifically in 1943, where you're talking just more than half of the planes we send up getting shot down in these early raids. And the stories up there are really incredible, right? I mean, they're flying, thousands of feet above the Earth's surface. They have freezing cold temperatures. They go through just countless tragedies. And I highly recommend you reading up on those things. And I'll probably have a separate lesson that focuses on the air war a little later. But moving forward, the Allied strategy is to get air bases that can bomb Germany and destroy Germany's ability to produce. That's the whole idea. If you bomb their cities, bomb their factories, bomb their infrastructure, they can't produce, they can't mobilize. And that's going to be the Allied strategy. And we're going to do that primarily starting with those initial bombings in 1943. Now, Stalin really wants the Allies to open up another front. And we will. It's just not going to be where Stalin wants it. Stalin wants us to invade Western Europe. However, in 1942 and then early 1943, we simply did not have the ability to do that. Now, after the Battle of Stalingrad, right, 1943 February, the United States is going to launch Operation Torch. Operation Torch is an invasion of Western Africa or Northwestern Africa, where the United States is going to go in and try and push the Italians and the Nazis out of that area. Simultaneously, the British, led by Bernard Montgomery, are going to start pushing from Egypt and push them out of Africa. And so they're going to liberate the colonial holdings of the British and the French from the Nazis. Now, the Americans, by and large, are very inexperienced. I know a lot of times we think, oh, America, we go in and we just whoop butt. And that's just simply not the case. Americans were actually outgunned and really commanded by and large in the early parts of this. We see a number of big battles like the Battle of Kasserine Pass, where the Americans don't actually do very well. Germans are going to outmaneuver them with tanks, and they're going to outmaneuver them altogether. This is going to cause the United States military to restructure itself. We're going to start to see not newer generals, but different generals get promotions. And that brings us to a guy named George Patton. George Patton is probably the most man-crushed general of World War II, I must say. Everyone seems to always be obsessed of him, and that's partly because there's a fantastic movie about George Patton called Patton, right? And so if you've ever seen that movie, you definitely have an appreciation for the man. Patton is very flawed, though. Let's be very real. Patton is a huge egomaniac. He really looks for glories in war. As far as taking care of his soldiers, he takes sometimes unnecessary risks. Though Patton's major strategy, right, is going to be attack, attack, attack. But he is a tank just phenom. He knows how to use tanks, and he actually has read up on how the Germans use tanks and improved upon their own strategies. And so whenever we think about Patton fighting the Germans, he's using the Blitz. Patton will always use air cover, tanks, and then infantry. He's always going to use the Blitz tactics, and that's how he's going to do it in Africa, because he reorganizes the Americans in Africa. They push across Tunisia, and they're going to dislodge the Germans. In Sicily, he does the exact same thing. And then when he does the breakout of Normandy in 1944, he does the exact same thing. He will utilize that German Blitz. Now, his counterpart is Bernard Montgomery. Bernard Montgomery is the British general of the war. Americans tend to sneer at Bernard Montgomery, largely because of the movie Patton. But if you're British, Bernard Montgomery is a big-time hero because he is a very good general, very good. Now, Americans don't like him because he seems to be a little bit more overcautious, but in a lot of ways he's not. He's just as go out there and get him as Patton. He just has different theories on how to do it. Keep in mind, Montgomery plans the riskiest operation of the war, which is Market Garden, which ultimately did fail. But still, Bernard Montgomery is going to do that. These two guys, while they didn't like each other, kind of create a two-headed monster that's just going to knock the Germans out of Africa. The other thing I think that's kind of neat when you look at the Africa campaign, when we do get that, right, that's when the bombing really starts to to tip off, and we're going to start bombing Italy heavily at this point in time. And then we're also going to start bombing, obviously, southern Germany once we get into Italy. The Allied bombing campaigns, we're talking over 600,000 Germans dying during these, day and night, destroying infrastructure and everything else. We also get to see some of the coolest organizations in the war. Obviously, we talk about the different air forces, but of course, you also get the 332nd Fighter Group, which is the Tuskegee Airmen, which you should know from movies like Red Tails or Tuskegee Airmen. This is a group of African-American fighters who are the highest decorated escort fighters in the war, and they do so against extreme discrimination at home. And the reason they're so good is because they had to pass twice as many tests as your average white pilot. But we're going to focus on them when we get to that air war. So the invasion of Sicily, which is going to follow that campaign in Africa, they almost immediately look to Sicily. Sicily is a little island off the coast of Italy, if you don't know, and here's a picture of it, right? Sicily has some, kind of mountainous terrain, got some marshy terrain at times. It's not the most hospitable terrain for fighting, and so there's a couple of different strategies. Now, George Patton wants to go across Sicily. He wants to go to the northwestern side of Sicily, then push across to the east. Montgomery wants to land in the south, push up the eastern roads, and use the Americans as auxiliary troops. Now, we're going to use Montgomery's plan, except Patton is going to take his entire army group and kind of go AWOL and just push across all the way to the west. And he's going to do that against a lot of different orders. Now, what he does by doing that is it actually does create a scramble in Sicily. It divides up Germany's armies, or Italian armies as well. And so it really kind of creates a scramble, and then it allows them to all advance. Now, it does create extra casualties, and there's a lot of debate over the race to Messina, whether or not Patton and Montgomery are unwillingly kind of just doing this, and their soldiers are dying as a result. Omar Bradley, who is the American general in charge of the Middle Army group in this assault, who's probably the most underrated general of this entire war. We see him in the movie Patton, kind of like criticizing Patton a little bit. He did not agree with what George Patton was doing, but he did agree with the end result, which was the capture of obviously Sicily as a whole. And the Battle of Sicily, which is, it lasts from July 9th to April 17th. So it's highly successful. We're talking about a month and 10 days, and they take over this whole island. The Allies land over 120,000 soldiers. It's an amphibious landing. They have to do this because amphibious landings of the size that we're going to see on D-Day just hadn't happened. And so we are practicing those landings. Okay. And as that happens, it does create some pretty interesting things. They capture 120,000 Italian soldiers, 10,000 German soldiers at Sicily, and we wound many more. Americans are going to lose over 2,900 dead, with way more casualties than that, way more wounded. Keep in mind, in World War II, your average American soldier, 95% of American soldiers who made it to a field hospital would survive. And that's thanks to blood transfusions, sulfa, and of course, penicillin. So we do see large survivals of casualties as a result of that. Now, almost immediately after the takeover of Sicily, the invasion of Italy is going to begin. And we're looking at the invasion of Italy in September. The invasion of Italy is one of the most controversial decisions that we have because there are a lot of people, specifically some Americans. Joseph Stalin thought Italy was completely worthless. Don't take it over. And in fact, the Italians had already kind of overthrown Mussolini, and Mussolini is fighting almost like a weird little proxy kind of conflicts all over Italy. But the invasion of Italy is going to be very, very man-costly, and the Germans are going to make us fight for every inch of that peninsula. They are going to defend it tooth and nail. And in fact, Italy does not fall until the very end of the war. It is one of the longest fields of operation for any U.S. war in our history. And so Italy, which starts September 3rd of 1943, is going to last all the way until May of 1945. And so keep that in mind. The Germans are going to put a guy named Albert Kesselring in charge of defending Italy. And he is, quite frankly, one of the best defensive generals of the whole war. He creates a series of defense grids that are going to just give American soldiers a lot of trouble. Now, what Italy does give us as we push up is it gives us air bases that we can then bomb southern Germany. But Italy is also going to be met with certain troubles. We're going to have a beach landing at Anzio. And Anzio is going to create a stalemate for about a month where our soldiers are trapped on a beachhead, and the Germans are going to shell consistently, huge amounts of casualties. There's also Monte Cassino, old monastery that we bomb, turns into a German sniper nest after we bomb it, and it just creates this horrific event. And so Italy is kind of looked at as one of these events that that really creates a lot of casualties. A lot of American and British soldiers die in Italy. And what are the gains for it? There really aren't that many strategic gains, because by the end of 1943, let's be very honest, they have the Turin Conference. At the Turin Conference, they say, look, we need to invade France. And as we advance, that invasion of France is going to go forward. And we're going to see George Marshall plan out the D-Day operation, which will take place in June. So that's really where everything's going to go. Italy is going to more or less stall once we get to Rome, and then it's just going to be a snail's crawl up, and all the resources are going to go to Normandy. But there it is. That's your Allied advances in 1942 and 43. We're going to pick back up with the invasions, the D-Day preparation and invasions. So until next time, see you later, guys.